When you hear the word betrayal, you normally think of infidelity in marriage, right? And that's obviously a huge breach of trust, but other forms of betrayal can be just as damaging and as unfair and oftentimes go unrecognized or even minimized by both the perpetrator and the victim at times. So in this video, I want to highlight 5 ways that you or your spouse may be betraying the marriage so you can recognize them, deal with them, repair from them, and not allow them to destroy your relationship. That's today on RelationShots. Hey, welcome to RelationShots. If this is your first time hanging out with us, don't forget to download your free guide to intimacy. You'll see that in the description area below. It'll walk you through 4 areas of intimacy in your marriage: emotional, recreational, physical, and spiritual, and give you some ideas on how you can improve and increase connection there. So let's talk about betrayal. Relationship killers normally show up in marriages in 2 specific ways. Number 1, deception, either lying about something or not revealing your true needs to avoid unpleasant conflict. Or 2, unavailability. One of you desires emotional connection from the other, but it seems to be unavailable or unattainable. Sometimes a person is experiencing betrayal or disloyalty in their marriage and doesn't even recognize it, doesn't even know it's happening. So I want to highlight 5 areas where you or your spouse may be betraying one another that doesn't exactly mean a physical affair, and so sometimes it goes unrecognized. I would say this: if any of what I'm about to explain feels familiar or uneasy to you, do not ignore it. The goal is to address it, get some help, repair it, and get a relationship back on track. Number 1 is this: conditional commitment. So clearly a healthy marriage is built on unconditional commitment, and when one or both people feel like they're in a relationship just so long until something better comes along, that's going to permeate the relationship and it's going to feel like betrayal to the spouses. And so what happens, you see this all the time, sometimes it's around disagreements around starting a family, jobs to take, where to live, how we spend finances. But when a couple does not have a shared vision for the relationship and where it's trying to go, that's usually because one person or both are conditionally committed to the relationship. And so if you feel like the other person's just hanging out, just making sure that something better doesn't come along, or if you're engaging in negative comparisons, which I did a whole nother video on that, I'll tag at the end of this. Negative comparisons are a key example of conditional commitment, where you are comparing your spouse to negatively to a either real or perceived situation or person. And in that case, what you're really saying is, I'm not really happy here, and so I start looking other places and comparing where I'm not happy with that other stuff. And so conditional commitment is a clear violation of relationship and breach of trust. Number 2 is a non-sexual affair. So listen, the reality is when you spend a lot of time with somebody of the opposite sex, maybe at work, maybe in other environments, it is natural for a platonic relationship to develop. But if that is not guarded, if that is not carefully watched, if boundaries are crossed, you can find yourself in a non-sexual affair that's negatively impacting the relationship, right? That can happen at work. We jokingly have terms like work wife and work husband, and we think it's funny, but that usually means we're spending enough time with this other person that there are probably discussions happening not called work, right? And so if you get into more emotional conversations, it has a danger of going a place it shouldn't. You got things like the gym, maybe it's dance classes, maybe it's extracurricular hobbies or sports, where you can end up spending a lot of time with somebody of the opposite sex. So as a rule of thumb, if your spouse would be uncomfortable watching your interactions with the other person, is probably in a dangerous spot. If your spouse would be uncomfortable with details you are sharing with this other person about yourself or about your marriage or your family, you're probably crossing some lines. So there are quite a few rules of thumb, and we could keep going on that, but you probably know if you're leaning towards one or not. But that is a clear betrayal of the relationship. Even though it's not sexual, emotional affairs can be just as, and sometimes more damaging than a physical affair, depending on the nature of the relationship and the feelings and the things that are said. And sometimes it only takes your spouse stumbling over some text or emails or some other app you're hiding, messages, and they read some stuff that they have a hard time ever forgetting. That will cause extreme damage to your relationship. A third way that you can betray your spouse is lying. Yes, I know that seems obvious, that intentional deceit and dishonesty will break trust in a relationship, but it's not always just outright, I'm lying to deceive you to get away with something I shouldn't be doing. Sometimes it's the subtle little things. Sometimes it's just not sharing what you really feel or what you really need in a relationship in order to avoid tension and conflict. That's still being dishonest. And if there's dishonesty, if there's lying in the marriage, if it's occasional and situational, it can be dealt with and it can be removed and the relationship can be repaired. But there are other times where somebody is just a compulsive, regular liar about all things in the relationship that don't even seem to make sense. And usually the case is for somebody like that, the reason they do this is they grew up in a home that was probably punitive. They grew up in a home that was probably authoritarian and really critical. And so children can learn to look good and to stay out of trouble, and they do that by lying to make sure they're not punished. So if you have somebody who grew up in that environment and it just becomes natural for them to just lie all the time, that's probably somebody that needs a therapist and a little more intense work to deal with that. So lying is clearly a betrayal and breach of trust in a relationship, but it's not always overt. Sometimes it's subtle and it's just withholding stuff that needs to be shared in a relationship because somebody wants to avoid conflict. In either case, that will cause betrayal in the relationship. A fourth way we betray is by forming third-party coalitions. Here's what I mean. Some of you grew up in families that were unhealthy and enmeshed, right? Sometimes it was mom leaning on one of the children for emotional support in lieu of husband who wasn't there, and it creates this weirdness. But even when people grow up and get married, this can happen. For instance, maybe you have a wife who's too close with her mother and runs every decision and idea by her mother and looks for her advice. And, you know, in the few situations where her mother's advice and her husband's advice line up, it looks like she sides with her husband. But the reality is that whenever her mother's advice and her husband's advice don't line up or contradict each other, she leans towards the mother's advice more often than not. That coalition is a betrayal to the marriage relationship. You also see it in cases where somebody's got a close friend that they confide in about their marriage, and I don't have a problem with that. But there's a big difference between having a soft place to land, a place to share feelings that is supportive of the marriage and supportive of the person, and somebody who is willing to engage in bashing a spouse with their friend, right? So if you've got a friend that you're sharing stuff with, and in turn you're bashing the spouse, that's now a betrayal, because you're basically ganging up on the spouse with or without their knowledge. But at the end of the day, that third-party coalition is going to be doing damage to the relationship and is a betrayal of the trust that you're supposed to be developing inside the relationship. So these third-party coalitions where you maybe have gotten too close to somebody, it's a sibling, it's a friend, it's a relative, whatever it might be, but when that relationship is harming your marriage, not a place that is turning you back towards your marriage and supporting your marriage, that's going to be a betrayal of trust as well. And number 5 is emotional abandonment. So this can show up in little ways, this can show up in large ways. So maybe something in a large way where one spouse is going through something really difficult and deep, job loss, loss of a loved one, miscarriage, health scare or crisis, and they turn to their spouse for emotional support and encouragement, and instead of getting that, they feel like their spouse just leaves them to deal with it on their own. Oftentimes that happens when a spouse just simply doesn't know what to say or doesn't know how to support, and so they kind of withdraw out of fear of getting it wrong. But it also happens sometimes when you just have a spouse who is just not there for you and has just made the decision that they're not going to be present emotionally. But it can also happen in lots of little things right? Where you turn towards your spouse to connect, and on a consistent basis, they turn away from you, or they dismiss you, or they minimize something, or they're not there. So whether it's just little things at work, or struggles with a friend, or struggles with parenting, or frustrations with an exam you didn't pass, but when you turn to your spouse, they're not there for you emotionally, and over time that can build up as well, and that emotional abandonment can feel like a huge betrayal and breach of trust in a relationship. So there are 5 ways that you or your spouse may be betraying the marriage without even knowing it. If you recognize any of those, I would encourage you to sit down, be honest about it, have a discussion. Of course, start that up in a soft way, in a kind way. I'd love to sit down and talk to you about something I've kind of been noticing about our relationship that's hurting me, and have a discussion around it where we can explain what's going on without attacking or accusing. But listen, these things will add up over time, so do not ignore them. Do not minimize them. Do not just say, well, I mean, that's just the way the marriage is. At least have a conversation to see if some growth or change can happen in these areas so you don't continue to feel betrayed. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Drop a comment in the comment section below, and I'll see you right back here next time on RelationShots.